Um, Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Jeff Fox. I'm a senior fellow at the East West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. And I welcome you to this webinar on markets for Mekong commodities. It is one of 4 seminars in a series on Mekong, China, and Southeast Asia in transition. The series is co-sponsored by the Henry Luce Foundation, the East West Center, the Center for Southeast Studies, and the Center for China Studies at the University of Hawaii, Michigan State University, and the Regional Center for Social Science at Chiang Mai University. Over the course of the 4 seminars, we hope to include some of the best examples of on-the-ground social science being conducted in the region. Now, let me introduce you to our 4 speakers. Dr. Ian Baird is a professor of geography and director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His recent scholarship relates to marginalized groups and nature society relations in Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia, where he has been conducting research since the early 1990s. Then I would like to introduce you to Dr. Ben Belton, an associate professor with the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics at Michigan State University. His research focuses on the political economy of aquaculture and captured fisheries development, agricultural value chains, food security, and agrarian change. He has lived and worked in Southeast and South Asia for the past 15 years. Dr. Nathan Green is an assistant professor at the National University of Singapore. Most recently, he has used ethnographic methods to study how commercial microfinance industry in Cambodia is entangled with the country's 2001 land law and how microfinance debt in turn affects people's access to land and use. And finally, I'd like to introduce Mr. Patrick Slack, a PhD student working under Sarah Turner in geography at McGill University. He is a development geographer interested in agrarian change in the Sino-Vietnamese borderlands. His current research focuses on ethnic minorities and semi-subsistence livelihood transitions. I am going to ask the panelists a series of 5 questions. We will spend about 10 minutes per question, although I imagine some questions will merit a little more than 10 minutes and some a bit less. And then for about the last 25 minutes or so, we'll take questions and answers from the audience. So the first question, and I'm going to start with Patrick. He's already centered on your screen. What are some commodities grown in communities in which you work, and what are the drivers of the expansion of those commodities? Take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. So my research takes place in the northern Vietnamese borderlands in northern Lao Cai province. Here, I research with transboundary ethnic minority Hani, Hmong, and Yao semi-subsistence farmers. And in this research context, I originally intended to focus on black cardamom as a key commodity and upland livelihood pathways. But instead, I actually found the numerous transitions between commodities to be the most interesting story. So before economic renovation policies, or doi moi, in 1986, ethnic minorities were, at least theoretically, part of farming collectives in the 1950s. While before they were predominantly semi-subsistence farmers who subsisted off of swidden plots of rice, corn, home gardens, livestock, and non-timber forest products like black cardamom. And they also engaged in small-scale trade at weekly markets. So the ethnic minorities in this region mostly sold a few commodities, but specifically the people that I worked with used to sell hardwood timber for coffin production in China, but also opium, which was in demand by the French colonial colonial state and at that time the Vietnamese state. Opium and this wood were actually banned in 1992. And this was also in tandem with a push for agricultural intensification policies in the Vietnamese northern uplands. So their push was for hybrid rice and corn seeds to be developed for surplus grain for both food security and selling the surplus. So this was an introduction of costs that people had not experienced before since they were swiddening plots. And therefore, black cardamom came in to supplement these needs, these cash demands, where opium and this wood had also been removed. So they turned to black cardamom as they already had access to highland forests, traditional ecological knowledge to harvest these crops, and there was also a rising price in Yunnan province across the border. So they pivoted household collection and production to the intensification of black cardamom as a cash crop. And so in many ways, cardamom cultivation has funded food security and the intensification of hybrid rice and corn. However, since about 2015, a number of human and natural events have devastated cardamom harvests and farmers, and are now growing over 9 new commodities to compensate for this, this lost income.
Thank you, Patrick. Let's now go to Ben.
Thanks, Jeff. So I'm going to talk about Shan State in northeastern Myanmar, where I was working recently. And the main agricultural commodity grown there is hybrid maize. It's produced by about half of the farm households in southern Shan and grown almost exclusively for sale and for use in the animal feed industry. But there are many other crops that are also grown for sale in the uplands and for a mixture of sale and subsistence. And so those include pigeon pea, which is exported to India, but also garlic, potato, tea, mangoes, avocados, ginger, turmeric, tomatoes, cabbages, opium poppy, and many others. So hybrid maize, to return to this, was introduced in the 1990s by the Thai company CP to provide a source of inputs for the animal feed milling operations that it was establishing in Myanmar at that time. But since that time, there are also large export markets, first of all in China and more recently in Thailand. And the poultry and pig farming sector in Myanmar has grown very rapidly. So about half of the maize is going to these domestic industries and about half is exported. Another big sort of driver of maize, I would argue, is this sort of ongoing process of commodification of agriculture and livelihoods in the uplands. It's a long-term process, but really accelerating in the past 20 years, driven by the growth of the cash economy and the integration of people into it, and the need to pay for things such as schooling and healthcare that weren't necessarily available before. And then also the sort of aspiration for goods such as motorbikes, phones that are very rapidly becoming necessities, and sort of that's driving a need to produce crops, commodities that can generate cash incomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, cardamom and maize. Good. I think we're going to hear something about rice now. Nathan? Great,
thanks a lot, Jeff. So I'm going to just briefly talk about some research that I've done in the last 2 years, actually, with Jeff on a larger project related to rice agriculture change in 4 countries in mainland Southeast Asia. I've been doing research in northwestern Cambodia, in the province of Battambang, which is located on the Thai border in northwestern Cambodia. Battambang grows a number of different commodities. The primary one that I have focused on, of course, is rice. There are, in some districts closer to the Thai border, formerly forested areas, people do grow cassava and maize. But in sort of the lower lying areas, particularly in the floodplains of the Tonle Sap Lake, rice is still the primary commodity. So there are many different kinds of rice grown in Battambang historically, everything from recession rice, rice that is grown seasonally, and then some rice that is grown, with irrigation, for example, in the dry season. I'm particularly interested in fragrant jasmine rice, which is the primary commodity exported on formal markets, markets to the European Union, to increasingly to China as well. What is driving the sort of expansion of commodities? So I should say that Battambang is one of the largest rice producers in Cambodia. It's long been one of the major rice producers since the French colonial era. In terms of jasmine, fragrant jasmine rice, it's the largest producer of fragrant jasmine rice. Some of the main drivers would be the things that Dr. Belton was just talking about, for example, the commodification process, market compulsion, rising household debts, families needing to sell in order to get cash income to pay for their livelihood needs. But in terms of sort of national policy, in 2010, the Cambodian government passed a formal rice export policy that encouraged, so anyways, my time's up, but yeah, there are other things that are driving it I can talk about later.
Okay, I'm sure we'll get back to you with some follow-up questions. Our next speaker is Ian Baird.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Southern Laos and two commodities in particular, agricultural commodities. One is rice, and rice obviously has been grown for a very long time in the lowlands and the uplands, but I'll mainly talk about the lowlands. And initially, rice, of course, was mainly grown for food, but more recently, there hasn't really been a huge expansion in area of rice, but certainly an intensification. And that's mainly to meet increasing export markets in Europe and China. And I'll talk more about that later. The other commodity is rubber, or sometimes called natural rubber. That's a more recent commodity that's come into the area since the early 2000s. Prior to that, there was no rubber grown in Southern Laos. And that was brought in through large-scale land concessions, not small-scale. So it's been a very different type of commodity. One is being primarily grown by small-scale farmers. The other rubber is being grown by large companies with land concessions in Southern Laos, a lot of which has actually displaced small-scale farmers in order to get that land, in order to grow rubber. So I'll talk more about those a little bit later, but I'll leave it for now since we're short on time.
All right, thank you, Ian. So second question. What are the main biophysical and socioeconomic problems farmers face in growing these crops? And Ian, since you went last time, I'm going to let you go first on this one.
Okay. So there are, I want to talk mainly about so for biophysical, basically rubber is mainly grown on the midland areas, not the full lowlands and not the very highlands either, in sort of the middle areas between 500, 600, 700 meters above sea level. And the rice that I'm primarily doing research on is in the lowland areas. I mainly want to talk about the socioeconomic issues. And I think the main one that comes up in terms of rice nowadays is labor, because rice is a labor intensive. I mean, it can be labor intensive, more so or not, or less so, depending on whether you're doing broadcasting or you're doing transplanting, and transplanting takes a lot more labor. And so we've been doing research in Southern Laos and Northeastern Thailand, and there's significantly less labor available for farming in Northeastern Thailand. And that is affecting the way that they're farming rice. They're doing broadcasting as opposed to transplanting in Southern Laos. And this also affects the use of chemicals, especially herbicides, because when you do broadcasting, you often need to use herbicides with that. And so the chemical usage in Northeastern Thailand is considerably higher. So these are, and then in terms of the rubber, you have an issue of people having been displaced from their land in many cases, and then they're being kind of driven into the wage labor market and end up working for the same companies that actually displaced them. And so they're sort of transforming from being subsistence or semi-subsistence farmers to being wage labor and actually growing a very small amount of their food. So I think that, yeah, I think I'll leave it for that for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's very interesting, Ian. I'm going to follow you with Nathan because you're both doing rice, and so there may be some overlap here.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. So, like Ian was just describing, one of the key changes in rice cultivation is sort of the intensification of rice production in Battambang province. One of the things that we see in terms of social economic problems or challenges is, like most intensified commodity production, the high cost of inputs, particularly fertilizers, but also increasingly costs of renting machinery, hiring labor, other inputs such as herbicides and pesticides. Many farmers are paying for this with merchant credit. So agricultural supply merchants will lend, for fertilizer, but also a lot of rural households in Cambodia are borrowing for their for other needs, for basic needs such as education, healthcare, particularly from the microfinance industry. So you have very, very high household debt in Cambodia, in Battambang. A lot of, where people sell their rice is to large scale millers, many of whom control the price of rice in Battambang. So when you combine high cost of input, household debt, and low prices that you can get from local millers, farmers are facing sort of a classic squeeze that we talk about in sort of critical agrarian studies. And that becomes compounded with biophysical problems such as drought, pests, etc. So when there is a loss of harvest due to drought or pests, farmers might find themselves in sort of these cycles of indebtedness. Yeah.
Thank you, Patrick. Nathan. I'm going to go on to Patrick now.
So I have some slides to complement what I'm going to say here. And Nathan set it up perfectly in terms of, and Ian as well, in terms of the household squeezes that people are finding themselves in when it comes to agricultural intensification. So similar to what Nathan was alluding to, one of the main physical limitations cardamom faces is extreme weather events. So in consecutive winters since 2015, there have been extended periods of extremely cold temperatures and precipitation, including hail, freezing rain, and snowfall. Snow was reportedly as high as 80 centimeters in high elevation cardamom forests in 2016, which was the most significant in recent living memory. So all farmers that I interviewed lost at least 2/3 or their entire crop, which was actually more common. There's a picture of cardamom. And so these losses incurred are about $250 to $5,500 US per year, so a significant chunk. Until 2013, black cardamom cultivation had been positively viewed by the government, but then the Lau Kai provincial decision, there was a Lau Kai provincial decision which aimed to curb cardamom cultivation across the entire province. So black cardamom requires a closed canopy forest cover. So farmers have actively protected this forest, but also have sought to generate closed canopy forest cover over the last 30 years since this became a prominent commodity. So this has led to interesting changes in forest cover patterns in the borderlands, and in this case study in particular. And this is an interesting example of where forest conservation and agricultural intensification is happening at the same time. So here's northern Lau Kai province and Bat Zat district on the very left, which is where I did most of my fieldwork. And in this land use and cover change study, you can see that there are large areas of fields, mixed shrubs, and open canopy forests as of 2000. About 9 years later, in the same location, there's a notable increase in closed canopy forest cover. So this is partially attributed to cardamom cultivators protecting and regenerating forests, but also governmental silvicultural programs. Things in 2015 got a bit more complicated. There was a program called Sustainable Forest Management and Biodiversity to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, which is implemented across 5 upland provinces. But the big thing here is that it established a nature reserve. So observing these trends in closed canopy forest development, the government was quick to act. And thus, so this is 2017, the Batsat Nature Reserve was established, which regulates the harvest of timber and non-timber forest products. So everything is illegal except for the cultivation of cardamom. Expansion of cardamom plots are restricted, as that requires the removal of some trees. And moreover, numerous government officials whom I spoke with said that they will eventually ban cardamom. So people that have protected the forest through cardamom cultivation are now going to be closed off on this livelihood strategy. And just the last point here, this combination of increasingly restrictive forest regulations and increasing weather events, devastating black cardamom harvests and threatening future ones, means that farmers are turning to an overwhelming number of diversification activities that I briefly introduced at the end of my last question, or answer rather.
All right, thank you. I think we had actually 4 very interesting presentations on that question. Now we're going to switch directions a bit and look at geopolitical relationships. So our next question is, how are these commodities affecting geopolitical relationships within their country, within ASEAN, and beyond? And Nathan, I'll begin with you.
Great, thanks a lot. So, Baton Bong is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the major rice producers in Cambodia, largest producer of fragrant jasmine rice that's being produced for export, for formal export. One of the things that we see in Cambodia is that the export of rice to international markets is controlled largely by the Cambodia Rice Federation, which is made up of the largest rice millers and exporters in the country. And so these large rice millers are extremely powerful local capitalists, many of whom have long, strong ties to the Cambodian government. And we see that they are able to negotiate a lot of the access to these international markets, often to the detriment of smaller millers, and of course, then ultimately to farmers themselves who have to go through these large millers to access international markets. And so we have seen some protests against this. For example, in 2016, many farmers blocked a national highway in northwestern Cambodia to protest against the low prices that millers were offering. In terms of larger geopolitics, until recently, the largest destination of Cambodia fragrant jasmine rice was the European Union. Recently in 2019, Italy, which is also a major producer of rice, basically asked the European Commission to impose new tariffs on Cambodian rice, and that significantly increased the cost of exporting to the European Union. And in its place, actually, China has now sort of stepped in, and since 2019 has been the largest importer of Cambodian fragrant jasmine rice. And this is part of a much larger geopolitical relationship I can talk about later when we talk about China.
All right, thank you. I was just made aware that I had skipped Ben on the last question. Ben, sorry, Ben. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Ian next because he will tie together with Nathan's, and then I'll go to Ben and you can talk about both things at the same time. Is that okay with you, Ben? Okay. All right. So.
Okay, so yeah, in terms of geopolitical relationships, those are things that have really affected both rice and rubber in southern Laos. On the one hand, the rice that's being grown in southern Laos is mainly glutinous rice or sticky rice, and China is now trying to buy a significant amount of rice from Laos as part of the geopolitical relations between China and Laos, and they are demanding that rice be organic or close to organic, what is sometimes known as clean rice, which is basically rice which doesn't apply herbicides or pesticides, but may use a small amount of chemical fertilizer. And this rice is being sold essentially as organic rice in China. And as I will discuss a little bit later, that's greatly affected the way that people grow rice and the way that's happened, both for the better and for the worse. And I'll explain more about that in a later response. For rubber, in southern Laos, most of the rubber is owned by big companies. But in northern Laos, it's mostly owned by smallholders. And those smallholders are very much dependent on being able to sell rubber to China. So China, again, is critical. And the political relationships between Laos and China have been very important in facilitating the export of rubber to China. In fact, it seems to be one of the most important ways that the two countries interact, in Laos trying to ask China to buy more rubber or buy more rice, and China responding. And so this is a very important issue. And that's, I would say, geopolitics has definitely affected the rice and rubber relationships between China and Laos.
Thank you. Ben, I am very sorry to have skipped you last time. I'm going to let you've got 4 minutes, and I'll let you figure out how you want to use it. Okay,
thanks, Jeff. So I'll go through the 2 questions. So the first one on the biophysical and socio-economic problems. I think the 2 big things that farmers always mention, that always come up in conversation, are unpredictable prices and weather, as some other presenters have alluded to. And so you can have a year when the weather is good, produce a good crop, but the price is low, or vice versa. Maybe the price is good, but you have a poor crop. And you have to be really lucky to get the combination of both. It only happens every few years. And so the maize price fluctuates a lot from year to year. That's partly because of prices in international markets, globally, but also because so much of the crop until very recently was exported to China. And that trade is actually informal overland trade. So there are high import tariffs on maize. And so most of it is smuggled actually across the border. The authorities know that this is going on, but they usually turn a blind eye. But from time to time, there will be crackdowns on this border trade for weeks or even months at a time, and that causes big drops in the price. But the fluctuating prices are by no means exclusive to maize. So it's quite common to hear stories, for instance, of people growing garlic or tomatoes who are forced to dump their crops because they're unable to sell because the price is so low. Traders don't want to buy them, and it's not worth taking them to market. On the weather point, most of the agriculture in Shan is rain-fed, and actually one of the reasons why maize is very widely grown is because it tends to be a bit more robust to poor rainfall than some of the traditional crops like soy and sesame, and the climate is certainly becoming less predictable. So moving on to the second point about the geopolitical relationships. I've talked about the closures of border trade, and there was certainly a perception amongst some respondents that we spoke to that maybe sometimes these border closures are politically motivated. So it's not just maize that's exported overland, it's also rice and various other crops through this informal trade. And so it can be used to apply political leverage to Myanmar perhaps. But it's quite difficult to untangle all of the reasons why that trade fluctuates. So actually, after a prolonged closure of the border in 2019, Myanmar began to export maize to Thailand, and in quite large quantities, more than 1 million tons in 2020. And it's not totally clear how, to me at least, how this came about, whether it's because traders have just been forced to open up a new route, or whether there was some kind of change on the Thai side. So possibly linked to ASEAN integration of markets, that the Thai government has allowed imports of maize that weren't possible before. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
I didn't mute myself. Thank you. Very interesting. I'm not going to ask it, but I do think COVID may have played a role in here at some place. So let's go on to Patrick. Have I got this correct?
Yeah, you got it. So I sort of looked at this question. I look at this as more of an internal question. So in Vietnam, rural highland interventions are predicated on Enlightenment ideologies of societal progress and modernization, borrowed from France during the colonial era, and then the former USSR in socialist solidarity. So lowland ethnic majority governments, it's been implementing and constructing policies based on the perception of upland ethnic minorities being backwards, uneducated, or the least evolved. So this isn't to say that policies are necessarily ill-intentioned. Rather, it highlights a sort of top-down approach to development that leaves little consideration for trusted and culturally appropriate ethnic minority livelihood strategies. It neglects a lot of local agroecological contexts and commodities that are already trusted with trade networks such as cardamom. And this sort of policy approach can be seen through the banning of time-tested upland livelihood activities, swidden agriculture, for example, opium, hardwood timber cultivation, and now black cardamom cultivation. So now instead they're promoting more ideal livelihoods with newer medicinal crops, silvicultural like trees as well, or crops as well, pardon me, and livestock commodities, trying to sort of make these more legible farmers accessible through these commodities. And so these numerous pushes for these preferred livelihood strategies are environmental, economic, or for sort of political organization, imposed again by the central government and aiming to integrate these frontier and borderland farmers. Thanks.
Thank you. Very interesting. I think there are certainly commonalities among our four speakers and our different commodities across the region. Moving on to the fourth question. What do you think are some of the more positive outcomes of commodity initiatives in Southeast Asia from your own research vantage point? And this time I'm going to begin with Ben.
Thanks, Jeff. So I would say that nearly all of the commodity crops that are grown in Shan have actually emerged in the absence of state intervention or promotion, and sometimes even thrived because of that lack of intervention. So in Myanmar, the state has historically focused almost exclusively on promotion of production of rice in the lowlands. So that's a very different scenario to, say, Thailand or Vietnam, as we've just heard. And so I think in some of the recent literature on Myanmar, maize tends to get a bit of a bad rap, but actually in the research that I've been involved in, it seems that the wide uptake of maize is actually in large part because it's somewhat less risky than other cash crops. So basically all of the alternative cash crops are risky. They have some kind of combination of high levels of input use, high levels of investment. They can be labor intensive, they're sensitive to weather, pests, disease, and they're sort of vulnerable to large and unpredictable fluctuations in price. And so maize is actually, I think, planted so widely in part because when financial losses occur, they tend not to be as catastrophic as they might be with some other crops. As I've mentioned before, it's a relatively climate resilient crop. There's a large market with many buyers, so people are assured that they can always sell. And it's also a relatively easy crop to grow and doesn't require a huge amount of labor. And so that makes it somewhat less risky than some of the alternatives. So I think it's really important to understand individual crops as part of a broader livelihood system and kind of set of bounded possibilities that people have open to them. And it's also really important to sort of take into account off-farm activities as well as on-farm activities. So, even in Shan, half of the income is coming from off-farm activities. And so really a focus on a single commodity can be a bit limiting. It's really important to understand the whole context in which livelihoods and sort of cropping decisions are taking place.
Thank you, Ben. That's, of course, as you said, not what we've been reading about maize in Myanmar. You put a positive spin on it, which is what the question asked for, and which was very interesting. Patrick, do you want to speak about your work about cardamom?
Yeah, I probably will not be as optimistic, so sorry. Black cardamom was a great income option until weather events came along and the state deemed it an unworthy livelihood activity. The recent commodity programs that have been deployed in its place through the Natural Reserve actually, and also just provincial policies broadly, are injecting these new varieties of crops without really any sort of context markets and really poor agricultural extension. I think generally, if they're done well and researched well, commodity initiatives can do a good job of improving food security through disposable income for intensified crop production. But I think a little bit more research by government officials and companies alike could try to consider local cultures and agricultural calendars and sort of respect those before these specific cash cropping pathways are recommended, like Ben was saying. The markets for these new commodities should be cautiously planned. And I mean, in the past, across the uplands, there have been numerous commodities that have been promoted and then leave farmers with gluts. Again, like what was said before about tomatoes and garlic being just left to waste. So as the commodity initiatives that have been introduced in my research context, specific crops have been thrown in very ad hoc and without sort of substantial planning. Farmers rolled their eyes when I asked them about a new cash crop that was coming along. So I think more coordinated state planned efforts, supporting a limited number of commodities that have a guaranteed sort of supply line would be fantastic. And that would actually build trust with local communities, whereas a lot of bridges have been burned with what I've seen. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I'm not a panelist here, but I've seen similar things in Thailand where farmers are encouraged to grow high value crops, which don't turn out to be high value in the long term. Okay, let's go to Ian now.
Okay, so I have quite a positive take on what's happened with rice. So some people talked about the commodity squeeze that occurs with small farmers, and I've certainly seen that in a lot of cases. But what I see with small scale farmers in southern Laos and Sawanakhet province in particular, is that actually the vast majority of them, if you talk to them 20 years ago, they were not producing enough rice to consume. You know, they needed to hire their labor out to go elsewhere. They had to do other things to make money. Now, the vast majority are growing enough rice to eat and are selling rice, a huge increase. So actually, people generally report being much better off now than they were 20 years ago. That's the general consensus amongst the farmers. Now, the interesting thing is when it comes to do with China's buying power, and we always hear these negative things about, you know, China causing a lot of negative environmental impacts by importing crops that are like bananas in particular, use a lot of herbicides, and that's a big problem that we all know about maybe. But when it comes to rice, the actual opposite is happening because China is insisting on organic rice, and there's big millers now in southern Laos who are testing the rice and really preventing people from using a lot of chemicals. And they're giving them a relatively decent price for their rice as well. And actually, this has resulted in a lot less chemical use. We see that in southern Laos is way less chemical use for lowland rice than any of the other 3 countries or any of the other locations we've been looking at. And this is largely because 70% of the rice now is being bought by these large millers who are then, putting it together and exporting to Europe and to China. And they're putting standards onto that in terms of chemical use, because both the European market and the China market, they seem to see Laos as a natural market for organics, and it's becoming a kind of niche market for organics in Laos. And so that's having a big impact. And there are some positive things happening as a result.
Thank you, Ian. I know from our interviews and the 5 watersheds we've been studying that Laos always had the lowest pesticide and fertilizer use. But it is, and I'm glad, it's a good argument that the Chinese promoted organic rice is a positive influence. Okay, Nathan, what do you have to say to this?
Great. Yeah, thanks. So I think that the main commodity initiatives pursued by the Cambodian government really in the last 10, 15 years has been to formalize exports of higher value varieties of rice. So Cambodia in the 2000s, a lot of its rice that was produced was actually traded informally, exported informally to Vietnam and Thailand, where it was then processed and milled. So the big goal has been to build up the milling capacity of Cambodia industry so that they can process the rice before exporting it, and focusing in particular on these fragrant jasmine varietals, which are in demand and that they're in competition with Thailand and Vietnam to produce. And so, the 2010 rice export policy, it had a target of exporting 1 million tons of rice by 2015. It's never achieved that. There are around 500 to 600,000 tons of fragrant jasmine rice exported, but they, have, expanded it. But I think when we talk about, the sort of positive outcomes, like everybody here, context matters. And in particular, I would say, who's benefiting. So obviously, when we're talking about agrarian change, we're always thinking about, differences of power, class, for example, gender, for example. And so, where the benefits of this increased formal export market are going, I would argue tend to be, to larger millers, and then at the production level tend to be larger farmers who, for various reasons, historically and economically, have been able to sort of expand their productive capacity, perhaps their ownership of land, et cetera. So yeah, I think we have to think about who's benefiting from this new market.
Well, that's always an excellent question, one that we always are returning to. My final question of the 5 is, what kind of long-term impacts on Southeast Asia do you foresee through commodity initiatives via relationships with China or other Southeast Asian countries, and via economic development? And Nathan, I'm going to let you lead off on this.
Okay, great. So yeah, I think that a lot of attention has been focused on the China-Cambodian relationship in recent years, beyond just commodity initiatives like rice, particularly as China has become the largest, provider of development aid, foreign direct investment, et cetera. Tourism from China is now the highest in Cambodia. A lot of people have focused on the sort of geopolitical ties between China and Cambodia, particularly Cambodia, when it was chairing the ASEAN committee, that it would, sort of supported China's claims on islands in the South China Sea, et cetera. In terms of commodities like rice, one of the things we see is that since the 2010s, that the state-owned company China Oilseeds and Food Corporation, COFCO, which is now the 4th largest grain trader in the world, began to negotiate export quotas with Cambodian exporters. And so since that time, about a decade ago, in 2019, China became the largest importer of formal importer of Cambodian fragrant rice. It has now surpassed the European Union. It's providing a lot of aid to do this in terms of infrastructure like irrigation systems, investments in milling capacity, road construction, agricultural research centers. All of this, I think, to a certain extent, is tied up with both increasing commodity production, but also the sort of strengthening of geopolitical ties between the two countries.
Thank you. Actually, I think we need more seminars like this. This is giving a very different view of China's role in the region. Its role in promoting different kinds of agriculture. And because you're also doing rice, you want to go?
Sure. So if you remember from what I was saying earlier, there has been some positive effects from China and the European Union buying organic rice from southern Laos in terms of chemical use by farmers. There has also, however, been a negative impact, which I didn't discuss earlier. And that is that because these large millers are now buying most of the rice, which does give farmers a lot of additional security in terms of having a place to sell it. But the downside is that they require that the rice size be relatively uniform. So they're distributing basically a single type of rice seed, improved variety, to all the farmers. And so what you've seen is from being one of the most agro-biodiverse countries in the world in terms of rice varieties, most of those rice varieties have disappeared because farmers are being told that if you want to sell into these commodity markets, you have to use, because a lot of the native varieties are larger size seed and they look a little different coloring. And that goes against the standards that they're trying to promote in terms of having a uniform export market for places like China and European Union that require kind of uniform product. And so this is having a negative impact on agro-biodiversity. So in the long term, this is likely to lead to a reduction in the amount of chemicals used, which is positive from an environmental point of view and a farmer health point of view, but a negative impact on agro-biodiversity by people abandoning their native varieties so they can actually enter these markets to export to China and the European Union. So I think that's something that the people in Europe, when they buy organic rice, may not have been anticipating, that they're contributing to a reduction in agro-biodiversity by buying organic rice. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
So Jeff disconnected, our moderator. We're working to get him back shortly.
We could just go to the next.
Great. So we'll pass it along. Thank you.
Well, we'll go to Ben. I'll take charge here for one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. So yeah, I think as we've heard, it's possible, likely, perhaps, that we're going to see more of these kind of cross-border investments in new commodities that come up. It's kind of difficult to predict in advance what they will be. So that's like the case with CP introducing maize into Myanmar, or hybrid maize into Myanmar, or also production in response to new sources of demand that emerge elsewhere in the region. So this is like the case of Myanmar, then much later starting to export maize to Thailand. And obviously the impacts that's going to have are going to be extremely context specific. So it will depend on the crop, the environment it's introduced into, the local political economy into which that crop is inserted. So it's really hard to say in advance what the likely effects are going to be. I think it's also important to note that domestic demand and domestic investments can also be really important drivers of commodities. And we see that also in Myanmar with the case of maize, where the livestock industry in Myanmar has grown very rapidly and created more and more demand for maize domestically. And so it's important to note that commodity production is not only driven by foreign direct investment or export markets. Thanks.
Thank you. As you notice, I disappeared there for a while. I don't know what happened.
I think Patrick's the last one.
Okay, Patrick, please.
Thank you, and glad to have you back, Jeff. So I think as many of Vietnam's rural development approaches mimic Chinese policies like commodities with geographic indications, or the sort of one commune, one product, one hamlet, one product sort of model. We see this continuation of an agrarian transition in these uplands that's being embraced by some local farmers, while others are quite resistant to some, are quite resistant to all of these sort of different endeavors. So upland minority farmers that I work with generally remain quite cautious of centralized state interventions and don't really want to rely on state programs too heavily if they can avoid it. Despite other communities along the Sino-Vietnamese border with similar demographics fully investing in monocropping of cash crops like cinnamon, rubber, bananas, tobacco, where I was working, it's shockingly diverse. And I think something to keep in the back of our mind here is with regards to China, the local historical tensions with China remain tense, such as the Sino-Vietnamese border war. And so Vietnam as a whole is far less interested in engaging with China for investment purposes compared to, say, Laos or Cambodia. So with upland farmers living in these sort of borderlands, they sort of look for pragmatic opportunities to sell across the border, typically in small scale sort of non-formal trading ports. Prices with cardamom have been tumultuous over the past few years, a lot of distrust between traders and cultivators of the end point of the market, which is in China and Kunming typically. So I think time will tell if the state continues to try to pivot this trade to lowlands instead, looking internally to fulfill those markets, or if they will potentially look to other places if some of the tensions loosen up. And I think one broad question to pose just could be, what are the income mitigation measures if/when a commodity initiative fails? So for example, when cardamom crops were devastated, over half of my research participants participated in wage labor, with many of them crossing illegally into China. And there's a lot of issues regarding imprisonment of ethnic minority Vietnamese citizens over there, but also human trafficking. So even taking that sort of holistic systems approach that Ben was talking about, I think is huge for how we project these outputs down the line.
Thank you, Patrick. We've got Laos representing Cambodia, Vietnam, and Myanmar. We don't really have anybody speaking about Thailand. I'm not going to speak about Thailand, but I will acknowledge that Thailand is a major exporter of rice to China as well. I've got a number of questions now. We're going to switch to questions, and they're open to all of you to answer. I'm going to go back to our question number 1, which focused on some of the commodities grown in the communities. Question: the Mekong and China. What role does the Mekong River play in growing the crops you have discussed? Considering the source of the Mekong is controlled by China, are there concerns that China will use this as leverage in negotiations? Raise your hand if you want to be recognized. And okay, Ian, you were first.
Obviously, I'm one of those people that is quite concerned about the potential downstream impacts of Chinese dams on the Mekong River. But I do think it's important that we understand that the Mekong is sourced from all the tributaries in the basin, not just the mainstream. And in fact, a lot of the water that runs through the areas that I work in comes from other rivers that eventually run into the Mekong, and not only the mainstream Mekong. So I think while I'm concerned on the one hand, in some regards, certainly rice, is an important commodity, and that is affected very much by flooding or lack of flooding in certain cases. Also in silt deposition, if you don't have floods, you won't have the floodplains that are necessary. So there's a lot of aspects to consider, but I think it's a very complex issue. And obviously the Mekong River is critically important for various types of agriculture, but I think we also need to keep an eye on the tributaries and what's happening in the uplands and other parts as well.
Who would like to go next? It's hard for me not to jump in here, but go ahead, somebody please.
We'll go to the next question if nobody wants to answer it.
All right, all I'm going to point out, of course, is that, well, we have had 2 years of bad drought. The Tonle Sap is at unusually low levels, and that definitely affects the Mekong Delta and rice production down there. Patrick, I know you're working way up in the far north, but let's not forget the Delta either. Okay, the second question then, the group 2, what are the main biophysical and socioeconomic problems? The river. How are the modes of commodities delivery and transportation up and down and across the river changing? How does the political instability affect agriculture, specifically international trade and commodity prices? Who wants to say something? Who's gonna be brave here? Nathan, is that a yes? I don't have a...
No.
All right, this is a question that people do not want to take on. The river has not affected delivery and communication too much. Well, it never was used for communication because of the rapids, transportation. Political instability affect agriculture, specifically international trade and community prices. That is a different question. Okay, let me go on to the group 3. Oh, COVID. How is COVID affecting trade, particularly between Xishuangbanna and Shan State, but elsewhere in the region? And I'm going to put in there Northern Lao, because I have read stories about there not being able to get jobs and because of the drought, not being able to grow crops. Anybody have something to add here? Yes, Ben, thank you.
Okay, so I mean, I haven't been in Myanmar since the COVID crisis has unfolded, so I don't have the sort of most recent information, but I believe that for some months the border there was closed to trade, and it's kind of gradually opened back up. I would imagine it's had important impacts on migration as well as trade. I mean, there's a lot of cross-border migration into China from people in northern Shan to work sort of temporary jobs in China, and that must all have been shut down. And of course, COVID has big implications for migrants coming back to Myanmar from Thailand. That's had a really significant impact on livelihoods and the economy in Myanmar. So possibly more important than trade. I mean, apart from the sort of immediate border closures, people have sort of figured out how to keep trade going. But the migration is a more problematic issue, perhaps.
Thank you.
Can I add something here? So yeah, I think that Ben made a really good point that in some ways they've kind of figured out how to keep goods moving across the borders. But what's really been hard is for the people to move across. And that's really had a huge impact on, also Laos. I mean, a lot of people went to work in Thailand and, came back or got trapped there or come back and haven't been able to return. Recently there was a lot of COVID-19 has come into Thailand via, believed to be via Myanmar migrants who are working in central Thailand. And that I think is very unfortunate because there'll be a lot of blame going around and already the people from Myanmar are marginalized in Thailand. And so there could be additional discrimination that's coming out of concerns about people from Myanmar bringing COVID-19 into Thailand. So I think that the movement of people is something you really notice. I mean, even for, some of my PhD students that were doing cross-border projects, it's just been disastrous, because lucky, difficult to get to one country now, let alone to 2 or 3. So I think that, it's COVID-19 has had a big impact on the movement of people more than anything else.
I'd like to just add to that. I think what it sounds like everybody probably a shared experience across these different settings is the sort of translocality of livelihoods. This is particularly the case in Cambodia, but I know many other locations in Southeast Asia where rural producers that are growing these commodities, I mean, they're not dependent solely upon, certainly in Battambang, solely upon producing rice for their income, and so with COVID and with the reduction of economic growth in Cambodia in particular, a drop in manufacturing jobs, that a lot of households have lost access to income that they were reliant upon, both to just live, sometimes to help fund their agricultural production, but also in the Cambodia case to repay household debt. And so this is a big issue that a lot of human rights organizations in Cambodia are looking into right now. The issue of household debt and people not being able to repay their loans, particularly to the commercial microfinance industry. And the reason why this is important for agricultural commodities is that in Cambodia, a lot of loans to the microfinance industry are collateralized with rural farmland. So if you have people who cannot repay their loans, and those loans are backed by rural farmland mortgages, then that introduces a serious problem for many people. What do? And in some cases, as I said, human rights organizations are documenting distressed land sales.
Excellent. This is interesting. We've got a discussion going. It's not one of our original questions, but it's going. Patrick, your turn.
Yeah, one of the main reasons that I chose to work in Batat district was because it's adjacent to bordering Sapa district, which is a huge tourist destination. And so these two locales make up very similar demographic compositions and agroecological situations. What's interesting here is in Batat, you had black cardamom funding rice and corn intensification, whereas down south you had tourism that was funding this. So now with COVID hindering the arrival of tourists, a lot of farmers in Sapa are really struggling, and I think are contemplating their engagement with this strategy. And to the same extent, those that are engaging with tourism in Batat are also now very cautious and potentially looking to sort of mitigate the risks of these larger dependency on tourism markets.
Thank you. I believe this next question has already been addressed a little bit in one of the answers. NGOs. How are NGOs impacting farmers' agricultural choices, and in what ways? Does anybody want to take a shot at that? If not, I'll go on to the next question. You can come back and
I could say a little bit about that.
Okay.
Since we weren't talking too much about Thailand, and I'll mention that in Thailand in particular, I think their NGOs have had a big role in promoting organic rice. the government's now getting involved in that as well, but previously it was NGOs, and they haven't influenced a huge percentage of the farmers, so it's a relatively small number, but it has created some examples that now the central government has been taking up, and they've been able to convince the central government of the value of this and of the importance of the niche markets for some of these organic crops, especially rice. So I would say that in Thailand, more than elsewhere, NGOs have had an important role to play in promotion of organic agriculture.
Thank you. And that was a good insight. Anybody else have anything to add here? I'm getting a bit lost, but I think this is my next one: labor in commodity productions. Labor in producing commodities. In many areas of the region, it seems that there are two seemingly irreconcilable trends: a lack of labor availability for farming in Northeast Thailand, in particular with outflow of labor migrants. This is a migration question. What is the reason for this? The lack of private agricultural land ownership to blame. I think you get the idea of the question. The migration question: what is causing migration? Is it driven by poverty, or is it driven by people's ambitions? Basically, is what it comes down to me. Well, I'm going to let somebody else go, because
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the classic question about, is migration driven by pull factors or push factors, right? And it's a combination of both. It depends on circumstances. So it's, I think a lot of it is people trying to just manage risk a lot of the time, also respond to opportunities. But the situation that I've described with agriculture, or certainly producing to sell, is that you might produce a variety of crops, and maybe you have a good year with one, you have a bad year with the other one, or maybe this year is a good year with one and next year is a bad year. And so overall, it's very difficult, I think, for most rural households below a certain threshold to kind of accumulate through agriculture. And so, so it's a more sort of direct route to potentially sort of expanded reproduction is to migrate or to work off farm. Obviously, it can be risky too. So it's a strategy that doesn't necessarily pay off, but it's really people just trying to, find what seems to be the best route to sort of, improving their position.
I think, did anybody else want to say something here?
I would just add when we talk about migration, I mean, thinking about in terms of rural households, what is their sort of class or economic standing? And that will, of course, affect reasons for migration and also outcomes of migration. So if you're a migrant from a wealthier household, migrating to the city, you might be migrating and pursuing education, or you might be pursuing a job, and you, because of your social and economic capital, have the ability to find and network better jobs. And then that sort of makes you a bit more upwardly mobile. Whereas if you're coming from a more marginal, vulnerable household, and then you might have to send a lot of your money home, as remittances to support your family, and therefore you're not able to take as much advantage of opportunities in, say, urban areas. And in fact, this is a great argument that was just recently made in a book, Going Nowhere Fast, by two geographers, Sabina Lorenik and Lori Parsons, just this last year, in the Cambodia context.
Thank you. I'm going to add another variable, and that is where you live. If you're in the Red River Delta and can go back and forth to the factories up by Hanoi, or if you're in the Central Plains of Thailand and can go to a nearby factory, that's very different than living in a more remote location where you
Can I-
have to do long-term.
I'll just add a little bit here. Just the fact that I think that it's important to understand, this sort of building on what Nathan said, that people have lots of different reasons for migrating, right? And sometimes it's as much to, but one thing that we do see very clearly amongst rice farmers in both northeastern Thailand and southern Laos is most of them have not lost their land. The vast majority of farmers still own their own farmland, and the sizes of farms have not changed significantly in recent years. And so that kind of goes against what some people might expect. You don't see as much land consolidation as you might expect. And so sometimes people are going as a strategy to gain income for their families. So they lose labor in the farm, but they gain income that can be sent for paying for expenses. But in other cases, people go just because they're looking for new opportunities. They're looking to see a new place. They're living in rural areas. They want to see the bright lights of the city and try something new, which most young people, want to do all over the world. It's not, specific to this region. So I think that, but I think the main point is that people are not leaving to migrate because they've lost all their land, at least in the lowlands. It may be somewhat different in the uplands where people have lost land to rubber plantations and they do have no land. That's a bit different. But for lowland farmers, because the governments tend to protect that lowland farmland from kind of outsiders from coming in and taking that, it's been much more stable. But I think the uplands is a very different situation. I just want to point that out as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to let that question be. We've got actually, we're out of time. We've only got about 5 minutes left, if I'm not wrong. And so I want to, Jamin, who is my backup, send me a message if I'm wrong on that. But
we've got about 10 minutes left.
Oh, we have about 10 minutes left. Okay. Well, there is a question here on that Nathan and other panelists have mentioned informal rice or informal commodities. What does this mean?
I'll just briefly say, because I think I responded in the chat box itself to a question about informal rice exports. Unfortunately, this isn't actually a question that I can answer. The specific question is, have informal exports declined at the same time that formal exports have increased? That data might be out there. I actually don't know it off the top of my head. But my guess is that our understanding of informal exports is always going to be fairly imprecise, precisely because it is informal. So how do you keep track of informal exports over time in a consistent way? I'm just not 100% sure.
Here's a question. I don't know what they say. They're directed to me. I don't know what's in the big chat box. And it's regarding the tension between organic rice and our agrobiodiversity. Is attention being paid to heirloom varieties?
Yeah, so I can respond to that. Unfortunately, there's a lot of interest in consumers around the world in buying organic rice or rice with low amounts of chemicals, including from richer people in China and other parts of Southeast Asia. But there seems to be very little being done to actually protect the heirloom varieties or there of course is Erie has collecting different seed varieties. They've been doing that for a long time already, but there's very little being done in situ to protect those varieties within the farms that people exist. And I was actually quite surprised that when we went and talked to farmers, they were actually not as concerned about that as I would expect. They were a little disappointed that the improved varieties they receive now, they have to trade them in every few years. Otherwise, the quality goes down significantly. And that they don't like that much, with the native varieties, they didn't have to do that. But they weren't really that concerned about having lost as much agrobiodiversity as they've lost. And I think that could be something that is more of a long-term impact that they haven't really been able to conceptualize that much at this point, for the farmers at least.
Anybody else? Patrick.
Yeah, just to build off what Ian said, I mean, a lot of the landrace varieties that people have had are really just kept for seed, if at all. Sometimes they're kept for specific ceremonies, sometimes just to keep it, but in the back of their mind, they just say, well, that's just hill rice, it's nothing. There's sort of been this shocking acceptance of a lot of hybrid varieties up north where I am compared to down south, where there seems to be a lot more caution and issues with distribution for relevant, more agroclimatically appropriate seed. And even linking back to the sort of question about informal sort of trade, what I think is really interesting is where I was working, a lot of farmers would smuggle rice seed and a specific type of fertilizer under their clothes back across the border because they couldn't get it from Vietnam, and Vietnam, either the government or DeKalb or some of the agro corporations over there weren't supplying them with seed that they found to be favorable. So there's a lot of ranges and preference here that I think should be better understood.
Thank you. The next question is concerns. Does the government and local farmers have different concerns, environmental concerns? Are they both concerned about chemicals and pesticides and blah, blah, blah? Or do they have very different takes on these concerns? Who would like to go? Patrick, I see you shaking your head, yes.
Sorry, so just, I guess one of the biggest things here is sort of the environmental reorganization of the uplands, building off of some of like Pamela McGill's work, like environmental rule, the sort of the justification for intervention on an environmental basis. That's exactly what's happened in my context, where a nature reserve has been established, and therefore for rehabilitation of the forest, to protect regeneration of the forest, this livelihood outcome is, or this livelihood strategy, pardon me, is now banned, where there's really not any science to back that up. And when you speak to cardamom cultivators, there's a very intimate knowledge of balancing forest cover, regeneration, and cardamom cultivation. When it comes to the use of pesticides and herbicides, it seems like people sort of, there's this delineation between those that are quite opposed and nervous about them, while others are sold on food security and uptake. And that seems to be related, from what I can tell, to lowland populations of the district taking on this sort of, I hate to say propaganda, but essentially the full sale of these being good for food production and all of that, whereas more upland populations higher in elevation are a bit more hesitant and not really caring to engage with some of these strategies.
Can I just add?
Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, so I think that in Laos, at least, there's a big difference between upland and lowland populations in terms of how they think about these issues. The lowland rice farmers that I've been working with seem quite concerned about the use of, and I think that one of the big things that's happened, which is kind of interesting, is that the attitude of government officials. So government officials previously were trying to promote, green revolution types of technologies, more chemicals, more fertilizers, but they weren't that successful because they didn't have a lot of, support that they could provide to that, and it didn't make a lot of sense to farmers. Nowadays, because the market has changed, because they've been, the government's promising China a lot of organic rice, their attitude has changed to promote the thing that they were actually telling farmers not to do not that long ago. And so because the market has affected the way that they think about these commodities and then how they convey that information. So I think it's really important that you get, and I think it really shows a trend when you have these low-level government officials really buying into this idea that the future is all organic for Laos, because they see that happening around them and how the market's affecting that. And they see the market as being more important, and therefore they see their niche market as being organic. Yeah. And so I think the reputation of Laos as a kind of backwater where there hasn't been as much development is actually for once kind of helping them in terms of marketing some of their commodities.
I'm going to make a cynical remark here, and that is that markets have a much bigger impact on policy than we do in all our research. We can, as Patrick has just said about upland farmers and what they know from generations of growing cardamom, that'll never get through. But if the market does it, it'll get through. Last question, I think, and then we'll have a little bit of conversation. And I think, Ian, I'm going to let you answer this because you're doing rubber. Have there been large-scale land acquisition concessions in the study area? And if yes, how has this affected livelihood and commodity production? We'll start with you. If anybody else wants to go, they can.
Yeah, so there certainly have been, you know, I'm most familiar with Southern Laos and Northeastern Cambodia, where those have been. And I think in terms of Southern Laos, you really had those coming in between the very early 2000s, about 2003, up until about 2011 when they stopped. They put a moratorium on new concessions, but still some of those concessions that they'd given out in the latter years, you know, were still being developed. So actually the development of concessions has continued on even up till around now, but it's getting to the point now where a lot of those concessions have been developed and there's not a lot of new ones coming on. And those have had a real negative impact on people's livelihoods. And most of the study has been on that early stage of development. And in fact, that's a project that we're thinking about in the future, Jeff and I and some other people, in looking at kind of the post-land concession landscape, because there hasn't been as much work done on what happens after these concessions are fully developed and how the local communities either integrate or don't integrate into these projects and how those relationships develop. So I think that that's something that we need to do more of. But these are certainly important issues, but they're important issues in the uplands, not in the lowlands. So for the rice growers in the lowlands, I was talking about, that's not an issue. But for the upland peoples that I also work with, it definitely is an issue.
And Jonathan Rigg would say, why isn't it an issue in the lowlands? Why are rice fields truncated? Why aren't they getting bigger? Ben, your turn.
Yeah, so this is a huge issue for Myanmar, obviously, and actually in Myanmar there are large concessions in the lowlands. So there have been huge areas in the delta there that were given away as concessions under the military government, with the intent of sort of industrializing agriculture. This was part of the intent anyway, not very successfully. And so most areas of Myanmar, there's a whole variety of kind of land concessions. So some very large ones in the south and in the very north in particular, but also kind of you know, sort of smaller and medium scale kind of land acquisitions. So, but from a whole variety of sources. So obviously through the military, through allocation of concessions to the companies and individuals with links to the military, and then through some of the ethnic armed organizations as well. Yeah, generally less since 2011. And I think maybe unlike some other countries in the region, actually most of the concessions have not been granted to foreign companies, for instance. It tends to be, actually, there are exceptions to this, but a lot of the land grabs that have occurred have actually been sort of domestic land grabs, if you like.
I don't think that's an exception. I think that's rather common. We had a discussion earlier about migration, and I forgot to announce that the next seminar towards the end of February focus exclusively on migration. So you'll have a chance to hear 4 speakers speaking on migration. So now we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to open it up to the panel. What did you learn today? What do you think are some of the most important things that came out of this hour discussion? hour and a half discussion. Thank you, Patrick.
I think I was going to try to buy some time for myself there to come up with something, but I think what stays echoing in my head is what Ben had mentioned about it as a system, and it's just so complex. And I mean, my head's just sort of spinning with ideas after hearing everyone talk and sort of trying to respond to some of these questions in a faster manner. But I think just diving deeply into whatever context we're really in, I think it seems like the most important thing that we can do so that we can really understand some of these larger trends. That's where my mind is at right now.
Thank you for being brave. It takes a graduate student to do that. Ben, please.
Yeah, well, it's been a fascinating discussion, and so I mean, it's striking by about how many commonalities there are, but also, of course, you know, how sort of contextually specific everything is. I think this is maybe an obvious point, but then you know, also lots of perhaps unexpected kind of events or processes that don't necessarily conform to your sort of traditional narratives about you know, how development occurs or how agrarian change occurs. So yeah, that would be my takeaway.
Yeah, I would just add to that, and I think that we need to look at these situations as highly variable, and sometimes the types of things that we might expect to happen based on sort of some of the theory or other things that we've read might not actually be occurring in the way that we expect, because there are so many variables involved. And I think we need to be open to, you know, the way, you know, a good example being, you know, you hear a lot about China, you know, negatively impacting the environment in Southeast Asia by buying commodity crops that are grown with a lot of chemicals and are resulting in deforestation and other types of impacts. And yet when you hear the rice example of buying organic rice and insisting on only organic rice, that, you know, it's having a very different kind of an impact. And so these are very complex questions that need to be considered, and we have to be open-minded to all the different contextual possibilities that we might encounter.
I guess if I would just say one thing, it sounds like I was hearing some similar things from other people's research, which is, you know, when we talk about commodities, I always think it's important not to just think about production, but also the larger household and how the household is reproducing itself and the various other strategies that are going into basically maintaining a household. And so that gets into all these questions of translocality, migration, et cetera. So it's important not to just be super production focused, but also thinking about it in the larger context of livelihoods and household reproduction.
Thank you all. I think this has been an excellent webinar. I think you all did yourselves proud. Excellent presentations. And I hope that our audience will be back for our next webinar in about a month. Where, as I said, we will be focusing on migration. A month after that, we will be looking at the Mekong, the holiness of the Mekong. And then the final one will be looking at dams. So I hope that you will join us again, and thank you for your participation in this webinar. So thank you, and applause for all our presenters.